Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Potawatomi Casino Hotel Milwaukee, home to 24/7 excitement, dining, and an on-site hotel at 1721 West Canal Street. More information at potawatomi.com.
Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape our community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
The first land transfer between a Catholic organization and a Native American tribe took place in Wisconsin in October. The Crosse-based Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration transferred land that housed their Marywood Spirituality Center to the Lac du Flambeau Tribe. The transfer grew from conversations about the sisters' role in Native American boarding schools. Those schools were used to forcibly assimilate Indigenous children in the 19th and 20th centuries. A group called Land Justice Futures helped facilitate the transfers of the property from the sisters to the tribe. Brittany Koteles is the co-founder and director of Land Justice Futures. She joins WUWM's Maria Peralta-Arellano to learn about what led to the transfer.
Can you give me your definition of land justice and why it matters in our modern day, especially in urban cities and then in places like the Lac du Flambeau Reservation?
Yeah. So at Land Justice Futures, we define land justice as centering racial repair, ecological healing, and community power in decisions about how land is loved, used, and governed. So land justice is about, it's about protecting the land from extraction, but it's also about the ongoing regenerative relationships with land. And it's about restoring equity and community power in the places where colonization and systems of oppression have kept people off of land.
Most of this interview, we're going to be talking about land justice in relationship to Indigenous communities. That is not the only communities that you guys are looking to help in that way. So can you kind of outline in other ways that land justice is being incorporated in other communities?
So land justice can really be a lot of things. At its core, land justice is about changing the way that we think about and relate to land and learning how to see how this system of real estate and private property is actually built upon a history of taking things and enclosing them for the most elite, right? Resources, land, the decisions that we make about land have been reserved for an elite few. And land justice is about amending the harm that's been done to people and land as a system of extraction and commodification has grown. So land justice can look like a lot of things. It can look like restoring stewardship to Indigenous communities. It can look like Black-led regenerative farming collectives, community-owned housing, putting power into migrant workers' hands by supporting communal land ownership structures. Land justice is about putting community control and care at the center of how we think about land. And so because of the story of this country, that often has to do with repairing harms for systemic racism, for colonization, for enslavement, and Jim Crow, we see how it often intersects with that, with systemic racism.
Some people may look at this piece of news and think that this really isn't necessary. There is often pushback when it comes to healing the relationship between African American communities, Indigenous communities, or even migrant workers, as you mentioned. So what do you want people to understand about this when they're reading these stories and taking in this information?
I think what people don't really understand the extent to which, one, that the role the Catholic Church played in the colonization of the Americas. And it's not just the role that the church played in the 14 and 1500s, which was a huge one. There are 3 decrees by the Pope, they're called papal bulls, that make up this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery. And in those decrees, the Pope said, go conquer, vanquish, and subdue all non-Christians. And it decreed that, it declared that any land unoccupied by Christians was empty, It's terra nullius was the Latin term, empty land and open to be discovered. Those were things that were written in the 14th and 15th century, but I think what people don't understand is those are the documents that are cited into the first U.S. Supreme Court cases about private property. They directly cite the Catholic Pope. And that doctrine, those papal decrees, have been cited as recently as 2005 in a Supreme Court case about private property. So we have, in 2005, we are citing a 14th or 15th century papal decree to legitimize that when the colonists got here, the land magically became vested. And that was Ruth Bader Ginsburg who wrote that. That wasn't, this isn't a partisan thing. This isn't conservative or liberal. We are Catholic or not. We are all swimming in the waters of a private property system that was made up by a small elite, reinforced by church and state, to say whoever has the money gets to decide what happens to the land and every living being on it.
Thank you for clarifying about who noted that. I think that's also an important point. And just a nod to how we're all in part of the system, no matter, like you said, our political affiliation. Yeah. So to talk about the land transfer itself, you kind of mentioned a little bit of the beginning, how we got here. So can you just kind of detail the journey, how this conversation started, and just the road to finalizing the purchase?
So this story begins, I think, in 2019 or 2020. The Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration started down a long road of understanding and reckoning more deeply with a boarding school that they administered in Odena, Wisconsin, on the Bad River Ojibwe Reservation. Up until that point, that was a school that the sisters were proud to have administered. And in so many ways, they, the stories they told were how they took care of Ojibwe kids. They began to have more conversations with tribal members, descendants of people who went to those schools, and realized we are not telling the same story about this school. This school was often a traumatic place for Indigenous families. And whether or not the sisters, had good intentions, whatever their intentions were, what's true is that boarding schools were part of a federal agenda that was trying to separate Indigenous people from their culture, from their language, from their kinship structures, so that they could be separated from their land. And boarding schools were a part of that, and they were forced on Indigenous families. Kids were taken away forcefully from their families. Rations were withheld from the federal government if families didn't acquiesce to the demand to send kids to schools where they couldn't speak their own language, where they couldn't practice their own religion. Some of the partners we work with say that boarding schools were as traumatic as the violence and war. It's a different kind of violence, and its impacts are still alive in families today. So the sisters were kind of coming alive to that story, and they were going deeper into that reckoning process, knowing that they wanted to be a part of a legacy of healing. And I really commend them for that. They had some leaders there that really were saying, we know this is hard. We know this is hard for some of our members to understand at this late stage in life, and, having a long story that was a very different one that they had inherited about these schools. And they chose to go down that road and tell the truth and uncover the truth as told by Indigenous people. It was also at that time that the order, because they were becoming smaller, they were making decisions about some of the land and buildings that they own as a community. And Land Justice Futures came into the picture at that point. So they joined us as we have a community called a Focus Community Program. We bring communities of sisters into learning cohorts to look at what are the ways that the decisions that we make about our land can be socially, racially, ecologically healing, can build community power. And we do the work of helping them discover what that looks like in place for their community. And communities like FSPA are in community with a national network of other communities of Catholic sisters who are doing the same thing. So they joined us on that journey in 2022. They went through a 2-year accompaniment process where they really, we got into talking about this history of the land in the United States, of the specific land at Marywood, and potential ways of collaborating toward and looking at the transition of the land into the future that we're also healing. So we kind of came along as a technical partner, a relationship building partner, an educational partner. That's kind of the role that Land Justice Futures played.
Do you think that this is a model that can be replicated throughout the U.S.? And how do we get there?
100%. I mean, that's why Land Justice Futures is here. We are saying we think and hope and know the first 2 acres of many. The Catholic Church is the largest private landowner in the world. Communities of sisters who are at the forefront of that church in so many ways are in a moment of discerning the future of the lands that they love. Yeah, and so that's what we really do is we are already hearing back from other communities in our network saying, this is awesome, we're studying this, who's next?
Brittany Koteles is the co-founder and director of Land Justice Futures. She spoke with WUWM's Eric Vaughn Fellow, Maria Peralta-Arellano.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting WUWM.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.